They tell you in the Schola that a Medicae's hands are instruments of the Emperor's mercy, that every life preserved is a prayer answered, that the wounded are blessed by your touch. They never tell you what happens when your hands become something else entirely. When mercy transforms into its opposite, when the Emperor's will reveals itself not as salvation but as an infinite, grinding mechanism that consumes everything it touches. I learned this truth over the course of 347 days on the contested world of Garis Prime, and by the time I understood what I had become, there was no part of me left that could refuse what I had been made to do. My name was Corian Vess, and I was 23 standard years old when I received my Field Medicae certification from the Astra Militarum Medical Corps. I remember the pride I felt when they pinned the caduceus to my uniform, the way my mother wept at the ceremony, the certainty I carried that I would serve with honor and bring light to the darkest corners of the Emperor's wars. I had scored in the 97th percentile on my practical examinations. I could perform a field amputation in under 2 minutes. I had memorized 4,700 medicinal compounds and their applications. I was ready, they said, for whatever the front lines would demand of me. I was assigned to the 89th Garis Regiment, a newly raised formation of local militia being integrated into proper guard structure after their world had been designated for tithe contribution. The planet itself was unremarkable, a feudal agri-world with sprawling grain fields and scattered fortress monasteries where the local aristocracy had ruled for 6,000 years. Then the Greenskins came, a massive wag that swept out of the subsector's asteroid belt like a pestilent tide, and suddenly Garis Prime became strategically vital. The grain fed 3 neighboring systems. The loss of the harvest would mean famine across a dozen worlds. So we would hold, the Lord General declared, no matter the cost. I arrived with the second wave of reinforcements, my medical kit strapped to my back, my las pistol holstered and unfired, my hands steady as I stepped off the transport ship into the acrid air of the forward base. The smell hit me first, that particular combination of promethium exhaust, human waste, and the sweet rot odor of wounds left too long untreated. The base was a converted granary, its vast storage silos now housing ammunition and supplies, its stone walls reinforced with plasteel and crowned with autocannon emplacements. Somewhere to the east, perhaps 20 kilometers distant, I could hear the constant thunder of artillery, a rhythm so persistent it seemed like the planet's heartbeat. They assigned me to Field Station Theta 7, a Medicae tent complex situated 3 kilometers behind the main trench line. My commanding officer was Senior Medicae Halleck, a woman of perhaps 50 years with grey-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and hands that trembled only slightly when she thought no one was watching. She walked me through the station on my first day, her voice clipped and efficient as she showed me the triage areas, the surgery tables, the recovery cots where the salvageable wounded waited for transport to the rear. Everything was organized with military precision color-coded tags for different injury categories, supply manifests updated hourly, strict protocols for contamination control. It seemed professional, humane, even. And I remember thinking that perhaps the stories of frontline brutality had been exaggerated. "You'll do fine, Vess," Halleck told me that first evening, as we shared a ration of recaf in her small office. "You've got good training, good instincts. Just remember that out here, we practice triage theology, not civilian medicine. The Emperor needs soldiers, not invalids. You save who can fight again. The rest." She made a gesture that encompassed the entire camp, the distant guns, the darkening sky. "The rest serve in other ways." I nodded, understanding the principle even if I hadn't yet experienced its application. In the Schola, they'd taught us the 3 categories. Immediate treatment for those with critical but survivable injuries, delayed treatment for stable wounded, and expectant for those too far gone to save with available resources. It made logical sense. Resources were finite. The Emperor's war was infinite. We had to maximize combat effectiveness per unit of medical intervention. I had written essays on the subject. I had never held a dying man's hand while telling him he wasn't worth the supplies. The first casualties arrived during my second shift, a patrol that had encountered greenskin raiders near the eastern perimeter. There were 7 wounded, carried in on stretchers by their exhausted squadmates. I moved quickly, my training taking over, assessing injuries with practiced efficiency. 3 had minor lacerations and burns easy to treat, returned to duty within hours. 2 had shrapnel wounds requiring surgery but with good prognosis. 1 had lost his leg below the knee, the stump already tourniqueted, his face grey with shock but his vital signs stable. And 1, the one they brought to me last, almost apologetically, had taken a crude greenskin blade through his abdomen, the weapon having torn through his intestines and severed the major vessels. He was conscious, surprisingly, his eyes wide and pleading, as I cut away his uniform to examine the wound. I saw immediately that he was expectant. The damage was too extensive. He needed hours of surgery, massive transfusions, antibiotics we didn't have in sufficient quantity. In a civilian hospital with full resources, he might have had a 40% chance. Here, in a tent with limited supplies and a queue of wounded that would only grow longer, he had none. I should have tagged him black and moved on. But he was young, perhaps younger than me, and he kept trying to speak, his lips forming words that wouldn't come. So I stayed. I administered morphine, far more than regulations allowed for an expectant case. I held his hand, and told him the Emperor awaited him in glory. I stayed until his breathing stopped, until his hand went slack in mine, until Halleck's voice cut through my paralysis. "Vets, we need you on the salvageable cases. Now." I looked up at her, my hands still gripping the dead soldier's fingers, and saw no sympathy in her face, only a cold calculation. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't kind. She was simply correct, by every metric that mattered in this place. I released the corpse and moved to the next table, where a soldier with a shrapnel-peppered chest waited for me to extract the metal fragments from his lung tissue. My hands were steady as I worked. That was what surprised me most, in those early days. No matter what I saw, no matter what I felt, my hands remained steady. The pattern established itself quickly. Wounded would arrive in waves, their numbers and severity dependent on whatever engagement was occurring at the front. We would sort them, treat them, send them back, or send them on. The salvageable returned to their units, often within days. The expectant were given morphine and moved to a separate tent, where they would die quietly, attended by servitors that monitored their vital signs and recorded their final words for the regimental archives. The dead were processed by the corpse handlers, their identification tags removed, their organs harvested if viable, their bodies rendered down for reclamation. Nothing was wasted. The Emperor's war machine was efficient. I learned to work quickly, to ignore the screaming, to focus on the tissue beneath my hands rather than the person it belonged to. I learned which wounds could be treated in minutes and which required hours. I learned to recognize the smell of gangrene, the color of blood poisoning, the particular rattle of a punctured lung. I learned to sleep through artillery barrages, to eat while covered in other people's blood, to perform amputations without anesthetic when supplies ran low. I learned, most importantly, to categorize human beings with the same dispassionate efficiency I had once used to categorize mineral samples in chemistry class. But there was something else I noticed, something that didn't appear in any medical manual. The soldiers I treated began to change in ways that had nothing to do with their physical injuries. Men who came through our station would return weeks later barely recognizable, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky and mechanical. At first I attributed it to combat stress, the psychological toll of continuous warfare. But the pattern was too consistent, too uniform. They moved differently. They spoke differently. Their responses to pain stimuli were reduced, sometimes eliminated entirely. When I mentioned this to Halleck, she looked at me for a long moment before responding. "They're being optimized, Vess, for combat efficiency. It's standard procedure for extended campaigns. The Departamento Munitorum handles it, not our concern." "Optimized how?" "Conditioning programs, neural adjustment, chemical regulation. The commissariat oversees it, makes sure the men can keep fighting even when flesh and spirit falter. Surely you studied this in the schola. I had, in a general sense. I knew the Guard used various methods to maintain morale and combat effectiveness, but I had imagined propaganda, charismatic officers, the threat of summary execution. I hadn't imagined systematic alteration of the soldiers themselves. Hadn't considered that the men I repaired might be disassembled in other ways, rebuilt into something that could kill more effectively because it could no longer fully feel. Is it voluntary? Halleck's expression suggested the question itself was naive. They're guardsmen, Vess. They volunteered when they took the oath. Everything after that is just implementation. I wanted to ask more, but a fresh wave of casualties arrived. A mortar strike had collapsed, a section of trench, and there was no time for philosophical debate. There was only the endless succession of bodies, the constant need to sort and repair and send on, the grinding rhythm of a war that consumed men faster than any world could produce them. It was during the 4th week that I encountered Private Macken, a soldier who would become the first thread in my unraveling. He came to us with a lace burn across his shoulder, superficial but requiring debridement and sterilization. While I worked, he talked unusual for the increasingly silent men of the 89th, telling me about his home in the southern valleys, about the girl he had planned to marry before the tithe took him, about his father's orchard, where golden apples grew in abundance. His voice was animated, human, untouched by whatever process was draining the life from the other soldiers. "You're new to the regiment?" I asked, applying syntheskin to the cleaned wound. "Arrived 2 days ago, Medicae. Replacement from the local militia. They said we'd be integrated gradually, given time to adjust. But they pulled us right up to the line. My squad leader says we'll see combat within the week." He paused, then added with a grin that seemed impossibly innocent given our circumstances, "I'm not afraid. Though, the Emperor protects." I finished the dressing and sent him on his way with antibiotic tablets and instructions to return if he developed fever. I didn't expect to see him again. The front line had a way of swallowing men permanently, but 3 weeks later he was back, this time with shrapnel in his left thigh. The wound was clean, the extraction straightforward, but something about him had changed. He didn't speak during the treatment, didn't respond when I asked him questions, didn't even flinch when I dug the metal fragments from his muscle tissue. His eyes stared at the tent ceiling, unblinking, and when I was finished, he rose mechanically and limped away without a word of acknowledgement. I caught up with him outside the medical tent, grabbing his arm. "Macken? Are you all right?" He turned to look at me, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Some fragment of the boy who had talked about apple orchards, then it was gone, replaced by a flatness that made my skin crawl. "I am combat ready, Medicae. I must return to my unit." "What happened to you?" "Optimization processing. Standard procedure. I serve better now." He pulled away from my grip and walked toward the transport that would take him back to the front, his gait stiff and regular, like a servitor's. I stood watching him go, a cold weight settling in my stomach. This was more than conditioning. This was something else. Something that stripped away not just fear but personality itself, that turned men into mechanisms dressed in flesh. That night, I went through the medical records, accessing files I probably shouldn't have seen. I found references to behavioral adjustment protocols, to chemical compliance enhancement, to neural pathway optimization for combat stimulus response. I found requisition orders for drugs I had never heard of, compounds with names that meant nothing to me but came with warning labels about neurological side effects and personality modification. I found transfer orders routing recovered soldiers, not back to their units, but to a facility designated only as Processing Center Secundus, before their return to combat duty. And I found the statistics. Over the past 6 months, the 89th Garis Regiment had suffered a 47% casualty rate. But their combat effectiveness had increased by 32%. Fewer soldiers were completing more objectives, holding longer against worse odds. The explanation was simple. They had been made better at killing and worse at everything else. The part of them that would hesitate, that would question, that would break under pressure, that part was being systematically removed. I should have reported my concerns to the commissariat. I should have accepted that this was simply how the Emperor's war was waged. I should have remembered my oath to serve, not to question. Instead, I made a decision that I can only describe as catastrophically naive. I tried to help. The next soldier who came through my station with minor wounds, a burn case, easily treated, I held back from the standard post-recovery processing. I listed him as requiring extended observation, forged the paperwork to keep him in the medical tent for an additional week. His name was Corporal Thade, and he had been with the regiment for 5 months. He had gone through processing twice. I wanted to see if, given time away from the chemicals and conditioning, he would recover any part of his original personality. For 3 days, nothing changed. He sat on his cot, staring at nothing, speaking only when spoken to, his responses monosyllabic and emotionless. But on the 4th day, I found him weeping quietly, his hands clenched into fists, his body shaking with what looked like physical pain. I approached cautiously, knelt beside him. "Corporal? What's wrong?" "I remember," he whispered, and his voice was raw with something I hadn't heard from a soldier in weeks. Genuine feeling. "Emperor's mercy. I remember. My wife, my children. I left them. I forgot them. They made me forget them. The processing. I can feel it wearing off, like ice melting. And underneath." He looked at me with eyes that were suddenly, terrifyingly human. "Medicae, what have they done to us? What have we done? I remember killing. So much killing. I remember laughing while I did it. I remember not caring, but I cared. I cared so much. They just made me unable to remember that I cared. I had no answer for him. I had no treatment that could help him. All I had was the growing realization that I had stumbled onto something far worse than simple battlefield brutality. This was systematic, industrialized erasure of the self. This was the Imperium's answer to the problem of human weakness. Remove the humanity. Thade's respite lasted less than a day. The commissariat arrived that evening, 2 stern-faced officers who reviewed his paperwork with cold efficiency. They found my falsifications immediately. I had never been good at deception and escorted both of us to the commissar's field office. Thade went quietly, already fading back into that mechanical state as the last of the drugs left his system. I went with my heart hammering, suddenly understanding how completely I had miscalculated. Commissar Volk was a tall man with a face like carved granite and a bionic eye that whirred softly as it focused on me. He dismissed Thade to immediate reprocessing, then turned his attention to me with the sort of concentration a vivisectionist might give an interesting specimen. "Senior Medicae Halleck informs me you are a talented physician, Vess. High marks from the scholar. Excellent performance in field conditions. She recommended you for commendation." He paused, letting that sink in. She also noted certain ideological inconsistencies, a tendency to prioritize individual suffering over strategic necessity. She hoped it was merely youthful naivety that would be tempered by experience. "Sir, I was only trying to. You were attempting to undermine sanctioned Imperial protocols. You falsified medical records. You interfered with authorized processing procedures. You demonstrated, through your actions, that you believe your judgment superior to that of the Lord General, the Departamento Munitorum, and the God Emperor himself. His human eye was as cold as his bionic one. These are not trivial offenses, Medicae Vess." I waited for the execution order. I had seen enough summary judgments to know how this ended, but Volk surprised me. "However," he continued, "we are in the midst of a critical campaign. Medical personnel are in short supply, and your technical skills are valuable. So I am offering you a choice." He leaned forward. "You may continue your service, with the understanding that you will adhere strictly to all protocols, without question or deviation. Or you may be transferred to the penal legions, where your medical expertise will be put to. Alternative uses. The penal legions. I had heard stories. Medical staff there didn't treat soldiers. They maintained them, kept them alive long enough to be useful, performed experimental procedures that would never be sanctioned on regular guard personnel. It was a position that combined the worst aspects of physician and torturer. I'll continue my service, sir. Good. And to ensure your compliance, you will be assigned a new duty. In addition to your regular triage work, you will assist with the optimization processing. You will see firsthand the necessity of what we do. You will understand that mercy, in war, is simply another name for failure. And that was how I became complicit. That was how they transformed me from physician to accomplice. I wish I could say I resisted, that I refused, that I maintained some core of ethical integrity, but I didn't. I was afraid. I wanted to live, and so I agreed. The processing center Secundus was located in a converted cellar beneath the granary, a sprawling network of stone chambers that had once stored grain and now stored something far more terrible. The air down there was thick with chemical smells, formaldehyde, industrial solvents, and something else, something organic and corrupt, that made my throat close. The walls wept moisture, and the lighting was provided by flickering lumens that cast everything in shades of sickly yellow. They processed soldiers in batches of 20. The men would be brought in fresh from medical recovery, still carrying their wounds, and led to a large chamber where they were stripped, catalogued, and subjected to the first round of injections. I was assigned to the injection stations, my role to calculate dosages based on body mass and previous exposure, to monitor for adverse reactions, to keep the subjects alive through the initial chemical assault on their nervous systems. The compounds they used had names like Calidon 7 and Synth Neural Suppressant Mark IV, but their effects were brutally simple. They severed the connection between experience and emotional response, between stimulus and the complex web of feeling that made a person something more than meat. The soldiers would scream during the first injections, a physiological response, the overseers explained. Not actual suffering, since the drugs were already taking effect, but I could see their faces, could see something dying behind their eyes, even as their bodies continued to function. After the chemical treatment came the conditioning. They would be placed in sensory isolation chambers and exposed to carefully calibrated stimuli, sounds, lights, electrical pulses designed to reinforce certain neural pathways while suppressing others. Aggression was enhanced. Hesitation was eliminated. The capacity for complex moral reasoning was reduced to simple binary logic. Kill the enemy. Obey your officers. Serve the emperor. Everything else was noise to be filtered out. The process took 3 days. Men would enter as human beings and emerge as something else, something that wore a human shape but moved with mechanical precision, that spoke when spoken to but never initiated conversation, that could witness atrocities without flinching because the part of them that could be horrified had been chemically cauterized. I participated in the optimization of 217 soldiers over the next 8 weeks. I calculated their dosages. I monitored their vital signs. I ensured they survived the process, because survival was the point. They needed to be alive to fight, even if everything that had made them who they were was systematically destroyed. And the terrible thing, the thing that haunts me most, is that I became efficient at it. I learned to ignore the screaming. I learned to recognize the optimal drug combinations for different body types. I learned to adjust the conditioning protocols for maximum effectiveness. I became good at my job, and my hands never trembled, and at night I would lie in my bunk and wonder if there was any meaningful difference between what I was doing and what had been done to Private Macken, to Corporal Thade, to all the others. The answer came during my 19th week on Garis Prime, in the form of a supply manifest that I wasn't supposed to see. I was working late in the processing center, cataloging drug inventory, when I found a shipping container that hadn't been logged properly. Inside were medical supplies, standard items mostly, but also several cases of a compound I didn't recognize, Mortis Neural Integration Serum. The documentation described it as next-generation optimization substrate for extended duration campaigns. I broke protocol and accessed the technical specifications. What I found made my blood freeze. The serum was a new formula, still in field testing. Unlike the current optimization drugs, which suppressed personality while keeping basic cognitive function intact, Mortis neural integration worked at a deeper level. It didn't just disconnect emotions from experience, it rewrote the fundamental architecture of consciousness itself. Soldiers treated with it didn't just become emotionless, they became unable to conceive of themselves as separate entities. They lost the concept of I entirely, their sense of self dissolving into pure collective function. The documentation called it a breakthrough in maintaining combat effectiveness during prolonged deployments. The soldiers wouldn't suffer from the gradual degradation that affected standard optimization subjects, because there would be no self left to degrade. They would function indefinitely, requiring only basic maintenance, completely incapable of despair or doubt or any form of psychological breakdown. They would be, for all practical purposes, organic servitors, lobotomized, erased, and according to the manifest, this serum was scheduled for deployment across the entire 89th Garis Regiment within the next month. I stood in that cold stone chamber, holding the documentation in my shaking hands, and understood finally what I had become part of. This wasn't battlefield medicine. This wasn't even optimization for combat effectiveness. This was murder of everything that made a person human, while keeping the meat alive and functional. And I had been helping. For 8 weeks, I had been helping to perfect the process that would lead to this final erasure. I thought about reporting it. I thought about sabotaging the serum. I thought about a dozen different forms of resistance, each one ending with my execution or worse. And in the end, I did what I had always done. I continued working. Because I was afraid. Because I wanted to survive. Because I had already compromised so much that one more compromise seemed almost insignificant. But something in me had broken. Or perhaps something had finally awakened. I began to notice details I had previously overlooked. The way Senior Medicae Halleck's hands trembled had worsened. She was taking some kind of stimulant, I realized, something to help her cope with what she was doing. The way the junior medics avoided eye contact with the soldiers we processed. The way Commissar Volk always stood upwind of the processing center, as if the smell of it offended him despite his approval of the work. We were all complicit. We were all guilty. But we were also, in our own way, victims of the same system we served. The Imperium didn't just destroy its enemies. It destroyed its servants too, grinding them down, stripping away their humanity piece by piece, until they were nothing but functions in a vast machine. The only difference between me and the soldiers I processed was that my destruction was slower, more subtle, dressed up as duty and necessity. The Greenskin offensive intensified during my 20th week. The Xenos had regrouped and were pushing hard against our eastern lines, throwing themselves at our fortifications with their characteristic mindless fury. Casualties flooded into Field Station. Theta 7 inches numbers we had never seen before. We worked around the clock, our surgery tables never empty, our supply of medical equipment dwindling rapidly. I operated for 16 hours straight, my hands cramping, my vision blurring, my mind reduced to pure mechanical function. Assess, treat, categorize, move on. It was during this chaos that I saw Private Macken for the last time. He came in with the others, his body so mangled I didn't recognize him initially. A greenskin's crude blade had opened him from sternum to pelvis, his intestines visible through the torn flesh. One lung collapsed, his left arm hanging by threads of tissue. He was still conscious, still trying to speak through the blood filling his mouth. I started to tag him, expectant the damage was catastrophic, far beyond what we could repair, even with full resources. But then I saw his eyes. There was something in them, some flicker of recognition, of the boy who had talked about apple orchards. He was trying to say something, forcing words through ruined lips. I leaned close, ignoring the blood soaking into my uniform, and heard him whisper, "Thank you for trying." He died while I held his hand, the same way that first soldier had died during my second shift, and I realized with a clarity that felt like physical pain that everything I had done, every compromise, every rationalization, every act of complicity had been for nothing. I hadn't saved anyone. I had just helped the Imperium kill them more efficiently. I left his body on the table and walked out of the medical tent. No one tried to stop me. They were too busy with the other casualties. I walked through the camp, past the ammunition dumps and the artillery emplacements and the processing center's sealed entrance, walked until I reached the perimeter fence where the sentries watched the darkness for greenskin infiltrators. I could have kept walking. I could have deserted, fled into the wastes, taken my chances with the Xenos or the environment, rather than continue serving the machine that was devouring everything. But I didn't, because even after everything, even knowing what I knew, I was still too afraid, still too indoctrinated, still too broken by my own complicity to take that final step toward rebellion. So I returned to the medical tent. I returned to my post. I continued to sort and treat and process, continued to participate in the systematic destruction of human consciousness, continued to be exactly what the Imperium had made me, a tool, a function, a mechanism that kept other mechanisms running. But something had changed inside me. Some essential connection had been severed, not by chemicals or conditioning but by the simple weight of witnessing what I had witnessed, of doing what I had done. I began to understand, finally, what Corporal Thade had meant when he said the processing made him unable to remember that he cared. I still cared, intellectually. I still knew that what we were doing was monstrous, but the knowledge existed in some distant, disconnected part of my mind, separated from my hands that continued to work, from my voice that continued to give orders, from my body that continued to function with mechanical efficiency. I had become the thing I had been creating, not through drugs or conditioning, but through the slow erosion of hope, through the grinding certainty that resistance was futile, through the terrible understanding that in the Imperium's war machine, everyone was both victim and perpetrator. Everyone was simultaneously destroyed and destroying. The deployment of the Mortis Neural Integration Serum began during my 23rd week. They started with a test group of 50 soldiers, men who had been through standard optimization multiple times and were showing signs of psychological breakdown. I assisted with the first batch, calculating dosages, monitoring reactions. The process was cleaner than the standard optimization, requiring only a single injection and 6 hours of isolation. The subjects emerged, walking and functional, responding to commands, capable of complex tactical thinking. But when you looked in their eyes, there was nothing there. Not the mechanical flatness of standard optimization subjects, who still retained some core of self even if they couldn't access it emotionally. These soldiers had no core left at all. They were empty. They were meat puppets animated by neural impulses, but containing no consciousness, no awareness, no sense of I or we or anything beyond immediate function. I tested one of them, a soldier who had once been a corporal named Garis. I asked him questions: his name, his homeworld, his family. He could answer them all, the information retrieved from memory storage like data from a cogitator. But there was no recognition in his voice, no sense that these facts meant anything to him. He remembered having a mother, but he couldn't understand the concept of mother in any meaningful way. He knew he had once felt things, but he couldn't conceive of what feeling might be. They were going to do this to the entire regiment. 4,000 soldiers, stripped of everything that made them human, turned into organic automatons that would fight until their bodies failed. And it would work. The test subjects performed flawlessly in combat simulations, showing no hesitation, no fear, no exhaustion beyond physical limits. They were perfect soldiers, because they were no longer people. I should have sabotaged it. I should have contaminated the serum, destroyed the records, done something, anything to prevent what was coming. But I didn't. I continued my work. I processed the next batch, and the next, and the next, 50 soldiers became 100, became 200, and with each one, I felt something inside me that was still capable of horror growing quieter, growing smaller, until it was just a whisper in the back of my mind, easily ignored. By my 30th week on Garis Prime, I had assisted in the complete neural erasure of 347 soldiers. I knew each of their names. I had their faces memorized. I could recite their home worlds, their ages, the details of their lives before the Imperium had consumed them, and none of it mattered, because they were gone, and I had helped erase them, and I continued to do so because I had become incapable of doing anything else. The greenskin Warg collapsed during my 32nd week. The Xenos broke against our fortifications and retreated into the wastes, harried by the 89th Regiment's optimized soldiers who pursued them with tireless, mechanical efficiency. The campaign was declared a victory. The harvest was saved. The Lord General commended the innovative approach to maintaining combat readiness during extended deployments. Commissar Volk received a decoration. Senior Medicae Halleck received a commendation for her medical corps' exemplary performance, and I received a promotion. They made me Chief Medical Officer for the regiment's continuing operations, responsible for overseeing the optimization processing for the next campaign. They praised my technical skill, my dedication, my ability to perform under pressure. They never mentioned that I had transformed hundreds of men into hollow shells. They never acknowledged what we had done because, in the calculus of the Imperium, what we had done was correct. We had preserved combat effectiveness. We had maximized resource utilization. We had served the Emperor's will. The 89th Garis Regiment was transferred off-world 3 weeks after the campaign's conclusion, bound for a new war zone where their unique conditioning would be assessed for broader implementation. I went with them, of course. Chief medical officers don't get to refuse deployment, and I didn't want to refuse anyway, because refusal would require some spark of will, some core of self that could still resist, and I no longer possessed such things. I write this now, from my quarters on the transport ship, surrounded by the muffled sounds of 4,000 optimized soldiers moving through their routines with perfect discipline. We're headed to a war that will last years, possibly decades. I will continue my work there. I will process more soldiers, erase more consciousnesses, perfect the techniques that transform human beings into organic machinery. I will do this because it is my function. Because I have become what I helped create. Sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I remember who I was before Garis Prime. I remember the boy who graduated with honors from the Schola Medicae, who believed in mercy and healing, who thought medicine was about preserving life. I remember my mother weeping at my certification ceremony. I remember thinking I would bring light to dark places. That person is gone now, erased as surely as the soldiers I processed. Though no drugs or conditioning were needed, the Imperium destroyed him simply by making him complicit, by forcing him to choose between participation and annihilation, by grinding away his resistance until nothing remained but the hollow function of a tool that had once been human. I still remember that I should care. I still know, intellectually, that what I do is monstrous, but the knowledge is distant, disconnected, a fact I acknowledge without feeling. The part of me that could feel horror, that could rebel, that could refuse, that part died somewhere between the first soldier I processed and the 347th, worn away by repetition and fear and the terrible weight of complicity. The Emperor's war machine runs on more than promethium and ammunition. It runs on the systematic destruction of human consciousness, on the transformation of people into functions, on the grinding erasure of everything that makes life worth living, and it runs on the complicity of those who serve it, who convince themselves that they have no choice, that resistance is futile, that their small participation in atrocity is insignificant compared to the vast scale of Imperial operations. But I know the truth now, even if I can no longer act on it. Every small complicity matters. Every rationalization is a surrender. Every time we choose to participate rather than resist, we become complicit not just in the immediate evil, but in the entire system that demands such evil. We become the machine we serve. Our humanity eroded piece by piece until we're nothing but mechanisms performing functions, unable to imagine ourselves as anything else. The unseen struggles of battlefield medics, they call it. As if our suffering matters. As if we're the victims here. But we're not. We're the perpetrators. We're the ones who keep the machine running, who maintain the system that devours everything it touches. Our struggles are nothing compared to the struggles of the men we destroy, the consciousnesses we erase, the futures we obliterate. I was 23 years old when I arrived on Garis Prime. I am 24 now, though the measurement feels meaningless. Time has lost its significance when every day is identical, when every action is predetermined by function and protocol. I will likely live for decades more, continuing my work, processing soldiers, optimizing the mechanisms of destruction. I will do this not because I choose to, but because I have become incapable of choosing anything else. Sometimes I think about Corporal Thade, weeping in the medical tent as the drugs wore off, and he remembered what had been done to him. I think about Private Macken, dying on the surgery table with enough awareness left to thank me for trying. I think about the 347 men whose names I know, whose faces I remember, whose consciousnesses I helped to erase, and then I return to my duty. Because that is what I am now. Duty without conscience. Function without feeling. A tool that maintains other tools in the Emperor's infinite war machine. The part of me that could have been something else, that could have resisted, that could have refused, that part is as dead as the soldiers I processed, killed, not by violence, but by the slow erosion of hope and the grinding necessity of complicity. This is what they don't tell you in the Schola Medicae. They don't tell you that the greatest horror of war is not death, not suffering, not even the systematic destruction of human life. The greatest horror is how easily you can become complicit in that destruction, how naturally you can rationalize your participation, how completely you can be transformed from healer to destroyer without ever consciously choosing evil. They don't tell you that mercy can be turned into its opposite, that hands trained to preserve life can learn to erase consciousness with equal skill, that the dedication you bring to helping people can be redirected toward helping the machine that devours them. They don't tell you that you will participate willingly, that you will find reasons to justify your actions, that you will become efficient at your own corruption. They don't tell you that in the end, you won't even recognize yourself, that the person you were will become as distant and meaningless as the soldiers you process. Just another ghost haunting the edges of consciousness, easily ignored as you perform your function with mechanical precision. I am Chief Medical Officer Corian Vess of the 89th Garis Regiment. I have assisted in the neural optimization of 347 Imperial Guardsmen. I have calculated dosages of consciousness-erasing drugs. I have monitored the systematic destruction of human awareness. I have perfected the techniques that transform people into mechanisms, and I will continue to do so, because I have become what the Imperium makes of everyone who serves it, a function without conscience, a tool without will, a mechanism that maintains other mechanisms in an infinite cycle of destruction. This is my confession. Though confession implies some possibility of redemption, some chance at forgiveness or change, there is no redemption in the Imperium's war. There is only function and failure, participation and annihilation. I chose participation. I chose to live at the cost of my humanity. And now I exist in this strange half-state, neither fully human nor fully mechanism, aware enough to know what I've become but too eroded to change it. The Emperor's war machine grinds on, consuming worlds and lives and consciousnesses with equal efficiency, and I grind on with it, one small component in a vast engine of destruction, performing my function, maintaining the system, destroying in the name of preservation, killing in the name of healing. They tell you in the Schola that a Medicae's hands are instruments of the Emperor's mercy. They never tell you what happens when mercy itself becomes the instrument of destruction, when healing transforms into erasure, when the preservation of life becomes indistinguishable from its annihilation. But I know now, I understand, and I will carry that understanding through however many years or decades remain to me. a hollow knowledge that changes nothing, that signifies nothing, that exists only as a distant whisper in the back of a mind that has forgotten how to feel its own horror. This is what the Imperium does. This is what we all become, eventually. Functions, mechanisms, tools that maintain other tools in an infinite machine that serves no purpose beyond its own continuation, that consumes everything it touches and transforms it into instruments of further consumption. And there is no escape, no resistance, no possibility of change. There is only the grinding continuation, the endless repetition, the systematic erasure of everything human in service to a system that has forgotten why it exists at all. I am 24 years old, and I am already a ghost, already erased, already transformed into something that was once a person, but is now only a function performing its role in the Emperor's infinite nightmare. This is my testament. This is my truth. This is what battlefield medics truly struggle with, not the horror of what we witness, but the horror of what we become, the ease with which we participate in systematic destruction, the completeness with which the Imperium transforms us from healers into instruments of erasure. And tomorrow, I will wake and return to my duty, because that is all I am now, all I will ever be, all that remains of the boy who once believed in mercy and healing and the possibility of bringing light to dark places. The machine continues, and I continue with it, and that is the only truth that matters in the end.